For sure, he was traveling back and forth from Russia. He married a Russian citizen. There was a lot of weird shit.
He was under surveillance by the CIA, so there's a lot there.
The whole idea of the magic bullet theory was just because they had to account for all the wounds in the bodies with just 3 bullets.
Recently, Joe Rogan discussed the truth regarding the JFK assassination, what we've learned from the recently released JFK files, what questions still remain, and connecting the dots on things that the U.S. government was trying to conceal from us for so long. This is part of a conversation with Representative Anna Paulina Luna, who oversaw the recent release of those files and the congressional report that I think is forthcoming on that. So let's get their take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
The Russian government agreed to release their investigation onto JFK that the previous congressional task force in the 90s had tried to obtain from the Russian government, and they said no. So they agreed to release that, and they'll be posting it publicly for the American people to go through later on this fall.
Have you seen it yet?
I haven't. No. So I'll be seeing it at the same time everyone else does.
What do you think is in there, if you had a guess?
So when I was talking to the ambassador, he's actually a history buff too. And so he had actually said that the Russian government, when Oswald was actually in Russia, had done a psychological profile because they thought, they're like, is this guy part of American intelligence? Like, what's his story? And they thought he was basically nuts. And apparently he tried to go hunting when he was out there, and they were observing him, and he couldn't shoot for shit. So they're like, he didn't meet our psychological profile. Then he shows up to the Russian embassy in Mexico City with a gun, and they're like, what the hell is it? Like crazy guys showing up at that? Like, what's going on? And then we find out simultaneously as this is all happening that the CIA, kudos to Director Radcliffe, had actually released something called the Joanides file. And George Joanides was actually, he's basically our version of James Bond, but more corrupt. And he was basically observing Oswald. He had lied to Congress. This was all in his file. He was then the CIA liaison to Congress during the investigations, stonewalled their investigations, was later awarded something from the CIA. So we have the CIA admitting that they lied to Congress, covered up the assassination attempt, or covered up the investigations. We had admissions from the Warren Commission, people that had been subject to the Warren Commission's investigation, saying that the Warren Commission engaged in witness intimidation. They omitted evidence. The single bullet theory never exists. The CIA admits that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone gunman. People ask, well, does this mean that you'll ever get the name of who killed him? No, because I don't think the CIA was like, kill JFK on this day and use this gun and have this person assigned.
Right.
But there.
Yeah, she's right about that. Even the people that thought, there was a conspiracy, multiple actors in this shooting of JFK, never thought the CIA would write it down on a particular document that says, we, the CIA, the benevolent defenders of the U.S. public, have decided to kill an American president, and then publish that paper. No one thought that. But look, she's right. The CIA had a surveillance program that they used against Oswald, including in his trip to Mexico City, which she spoke about there briefly, when he was in contact with Soviet liaisons. He went to the Soviet Union, stayed there for something like 3 years. He married a Soviet citizen. They emigrated to the United States in 1962, I believe. There's many connections like this that weren't unveiled fully until this recent report. Also, it is known, and she hinted at it here, but the Warren Commission did not receive all the evidence that the investigation had regarding surveillance of Oswald. They never got that. And by the way, it's not that surprising because the head of the Warren Commission was a sham. It was Alan Dulles, the guy that ordered the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which didn't please JFK too much, and that's why he dismissed Dulles, effectively firing him, and they're going to make him the head of the Warren Commission. There was so much fraud in this commission, fraught with conflicts of interest, but that's the tale that we were told for so long.
It was evidence of multiple shooters, for sure.
Well, there had to be multiple shooters. There's injuries, like one of them was to the front of his neck.
We had testimony to that.
Yeah.
And actually, what's interesting is when we first launched the task force, we had left-leaning news outlets that were trying to write hit pieces saying that I was basically launching a conspiracy theory task force. And they had to print the truth weeks ago. You can actually pull
up. What is it about people that don't want to believe that some conspiracies are real? Is it a comfort thing? Is it you think you're gonna erode trust in the government? Is it you just have such a rigid worldview, and in your mind that there's always been Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that's what happened, and because of that, anything that challenges your belief system, you fight against?
I think it's an ultimate appeal to authority. You know, the same idea was unleashed, especially at its high point, I think, during the COVID regime when, hey, just doing your own research, that was indicative of you being, some kind of deviant, some kind of, insane lunatic. But that was reading before the COVID regime. Jimmy Dore does a funny bit about this when he just says, they mocked and ridiculed us for doing our own research. You know what that was called before COVID? It was called reading. Exactly. And that is what this is when people just demean everyone for conspiracies. Well, I'm sorry to say some of the worst atrocities in world history were the result of conspiracies that were called that, and then they turned out to be true. The Wuhan lab leak theory, that was a conspiracy theory at one time. There you go. The Hunter Biden laptop story, that was a conspiracy theory. It wasn't really his laptop. The Gulf of Tonkin being a false flag, the second incident there, clearly. All sorts of episodes like this throughout history, even the Wannsee Conference and the elimination of Jews during World War II. That was at one point a conspiracy theory that a lot of people didn't buy, including people in Germany, by the way. So that's what we get from, this blanket notion that no conspiracies are ever true. It's the ultimate appeal to authority.
Well, specifically to JFK, for decades, the intelligence agencies were influencing what the print and press was doing.
100%. Until Geraldo Rivera. When Dick Gregory brought that film on the Geraldo Rivera show, and you got to see the Zapruder film, and you got to see what looks like a shot that makes his head go back and to the left.
Yeah, and
which would indicate he got shot from the front. I think he got shot multiple times by multiple shooters from multiple different directions, and I don't think necessarily Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't in on it.
Well,
here's the problem. People say, oh, Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't shoot. You don't have to be that good with a rifle to be you're on a ledge, so you have a secure rest. If your rifle's sighted in, and they said his scope was off, but that doesn't mean shit, because you could just drop your scope and it's off. All you have to do is take your rifle off of that ledge, drop it on the ground, and now that scope is off.
Yeah, and to be clear, that's where I am as far as the JFK assassination. I do think there were multiple actors involved, but I've never seen compelling evidence that Oswald wasn't one of them. And actually, suggesting that, oh, he was such a bad shot, he couldn't have made that shot. I think you undermine the narrative of thinking that there's a conspiracy and there were multiple actors by saying stuff like that. There's eyewitnesses of him in the area, plans to do this, connections with the CIA and Soviet Union. So if you're taking Oswald away from the equation, but also using the evidence that, he had connections with the CIA and the CIA surveillance program, it actually undermines the theory that there were multiple actors and that there is something wrong with this. So I'm with Joe actually on that.
Never drop your gun like that. And if you do, you can knock your scope off.
Well, there's multiple problems, though, because the Warren Commission actually never even put into the report, right? So, if you're conducting
let me finish.
Okay.
My point is, that wasn't a far shot. It was 140 yards from the book depository with a scope.
Yeah,
and
he
a
been
rifle
able to take
with
the
a rest.
shots.
No, you could kill a guy like that, and he could have been the shooter. Mm-hmm. He could have been one of the shooters. But I think there's too much witness testimony. There's too much evidence. The whole idea of the magic bullet theory was just because they had to account for all the wounds in the bodies with just 3 bullets.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think it was 160 or 165 feet from the barrel of Oswald's gun to JFK, not 140 meters. That would be a lot more because, a meter is, I think, more than 3 feet. It's about 3 feet, but it's much less of a distance than he describes. I know Joe knows this. He's studied it, but I think that number is just a little off.
And they found a guy who got hit in the underpass, rather. He got hit with a ricochet.
Yep.
Yeah. So now they knew that bullet couldn't have hit Kennedy or Connolly. So how do you attribute all these wounds to 2 different guys from multiple gunshots to a single bullet?
It's a magic
The magic bullet. That's what it always was. And that was their narrative. That's really what they went with. And, that's why no one bought this for, something like 60 years. And They still don't buy it after you've released the JFK files, by the way. And of course, again, deep state agents and the CIA are not going to admit complicity in the death and murder of an American president, clearly. That was never going to be part of the files, but the files that were released do include additional pieces of a puzzle that we can put together and glean information from, including the broader involvement of the CIA in Oswald and who he was.
Bullet, don't you know?
You have to find this bullet that fucking for sure didn't hit any bones. And there's more fragments in Connolly's wrist than there were missing from the bullet. The bullet looks almost pristine. It looks like they shot it through like feathers, or they shot it into water, which is what they do when they do ballistics tests on rifles.
Well, what's interesting is the Warren Commission did omit multiple female witnesses who were actually at the book depository that day that actually stated that they had never witnessed Oswald actually in the location or going down the back of the book depository. So that's an interesting fact.
Yeah, it's possible that he could have snuck past them. There was a lot of chaos. You hear gunshots, the president shot. People don't always think straight when things are going nutty.
That's true, but they sure should have still gotten that evidence. And again, I'm one that thinks that Oswald did take a shot. I'm not one of those that thinks he wasn't involved in any way, but that has nothing to do with the fact that the commission sure should have still heard that evidence for sure.
People have a terrible memory right after traumatic events.
Yeah.
Like, yes and no. Like, he might have been there or he might not have been there. He might have shot at Kennedy or he might not have shot Kennedy. But for sure, he was some sort of government operative. For sure, he was traveling back and forth from Russia. He married a Russian citizen. There was a lot of weird shit.
He was under surveillance by the CIA. So there's a lot there. However, I will say this. What the official narrative was, we now know is BS, right?
Yeah.
And
that I thought from the beginning.
Yeah, but a lot of the American people did, but to have their own government say, no, that's not true, to gaslight them and to push this narrative of if you question it, you're wrong, you're crazy. That in itself, I think when you're talking about like why do the American people not trust their government, it's really this fracture that starts around the Kennedy era and time frame. And you can see then that distrust kind of evolves. But going back to your original question, why do people refuse to kind of question conspiracy theory? Maybe there's some substance to it. And I think it's because it's more comfortable for people from a psychological perspective to live in this comfort area that their government might not do something like that.
Right.
Yeah, that's totally accurate too. I think there's a lot of truth in that, not believing that Uncle Sam is evil, that, being raised in a way that this is the greatest country that ever existed, jingoistic mentality about what America represents, a shining city on the hill that can't be shattered. And one of the ways to shatter it is to, believe that they're involved in some pretty duplicitous behavior, including the death of an American president. So that's exactly true. But again, that is what this story was, a massive cover-up. It was the beginning in many ways. I agree with her on this, too, is the loss of faith of Americans in their political system. A lot of it began in 1963. It's hard to deny that. And many people that look back on these times, truly believe that Kennedy was the last true president. The implication is that all the presidents that came after him were owned and operated by the deep state that grew up, in the wake of the Kennedy assassination and in this grand cover-up.
Right. Or might not try to cover up something like that because that's just an easy way of life. But look,
it's too scary.
It's too scary. But the fact is that, look, I've traveled a lot. I've dealt with a lot of world leaders. We are still the greatest country in the world. Make no excuse about that. But it doesn't mean that we can't call out and hold our own government and officials accountable. And so that's kind of what I've guess my mission has been this Congress and what I hope that it will continue to be. But I'm not trying to do this for like even the next 10 years. So for someone like me, people are like, oh, initially you're going to ruin your political career talking about this. This is crazy. Why would you even want to do that? And then, they're seeing all these big wins coming out in regard to transparency. And I will say, had it not been for the secretaries that have been appointed by this administration, this wouldn't have happened because under President Biden, he actually also tried to declassify things pertaining to JFK, and the National Archives never released it. And so in addition to...
That's not a good sign. None of that stuff's a good sign. Like, if you want trust from the American people, you release information. If you want us to distrust you, you hide everything. And you're hiding everything on one of the most important events in human history.
Yeah, and that's exactly what they're doing with the Epstein files right now as we speak. And they've acted in such a defensive manner about it, Trump included, that people can only wonder how evil this is, how far the evils go, and how involved that prominent Republicans, Democrats, bureaucrats, lawyers, lobbyists were involved in Epstein's sex trafficking ring, which, by the way, was likely part of a foreign intelligence operation. Most likely, if you're applying an Occam's razor, Mossad's, Israel's.
They were up until recently. And we're still documents that the JFK community, because mind you, I'm actually working with, his name's Jefferson Morley. He is not a Republican. He's a Bernie Sanders Democrat. But on this issue, we're working great together. And he's actually been helping me. And he's like, look, I've been waiting for this stuff for like 30 years.
Yeah, this is a hugely bipartisan
Yeah,
issue.
it's super bipartisan.
This
and
is something we can all get together. That and UFOs. Like, what's the one thing
Worst day of the
Democrats
world.
and Republicans both completely agree on? Like, tell us what's up. Tell us what's up. Who killed them and are they real?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, after so many years, it's only, more and more true that that's the case, that the American public wants answers on this. It's not quite as partisan as even it may have used to be when, Democrats were running the White House and LBJ took over after JFK, but we still don't have full answers. And I'm glad the Trump administration released the JFK files. In fact, it's one of three things I give him a lot of credit for in his second term. I'm no big fan of Trump, but that's something that Americans have wanted for a long, long time. And I spoke about some of the things that were relevant to those files being released, but there were two major other things I can think of that were relevant. Number one is Arthur Schlesinger's memo to JFK warning about the evils of the CIA were revealed for the first time in unredacted form. We had long known about the existence of this memo, but this memo, when unredacted, talked about warnings to JFK by Schlesinger saying, hey, the CIA is operating in a way that's contrary to the desires that the American people expressed when they cast ballots in the ballot boxes and resulted in electoral outcomes, including the presidential outcome, the House and the Senate. Well, the CIA that's growing up is essentially running the government on its own. It's running our foreign policy on its own. And you can see that when it came to, the Guatemala coup that overthrew the government of Guatemala, the Iran coup that overthrew Pahlavi with, or installed Pahlavi over Mossadegh in 1953, and the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which enraged Kennedy to the point of dismissing Dulles. This was a major memo, and the CIA did not want this to come out for a long, long time. We finally saw that. The other thing we saw is that Trujillo, the leader of the Dominican Republic, the U.S. government tried to assassinate him as well. So that came out in the JFK files. It's just, you wonder what else they've kept under wraps that wasn't involved in this investigation that we still haven't known, and this brought to light some of those secrets for the first time. But look, here's the big thing, is that the JFK story is not, its own thing. It's not its own phenomenon. We see these sorts of cover-ups repeating even in modern times, like the Epstein case. I think that the Epstein cover-up has the chance to linger and become a new JFK assassination cover-up because Trump isn't delivering. After all of his subordinates talked about it for so long, Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino talking about, hey, Trump is going to bring transparency that has been hidden by the Biden administration, covering up this sex trafficking ring when he gets into office. And then when they get into office and they release that memo that said there wasn't any blackmail, there were no clients, there's no evidence that anyone else was associated in Epstein's evils, we just have to, wonder what exactly they're hiding there. And it only invites the most crazy conspiracy theories you could possibly imagine. Crazy meaning, the regimes speak for that, but might actually be proven to be true just based on their response to this, based on the evasive nature of this, based on the fact that, Trump himself called it a Democratic hoax for a while. No, I'm sorry, the Democrats didn't use this against you, Trump, and they had every opportunity to do so when you were first in office, when the investigation began, and the entire duration of Biden's presidency. Very few Democrats talked about it at this time. And for you to say, hey, they're not my supporters anymore, if they're talking about this and still want answers, it just looks like another cover-up. And they've tried to pivot so many times away from it. But ultimately, I think the Epstein story will become another JFK assassination. So still open questions in the conspiracy and in the actual death of JFK. One other thing I want to talk about that is at one point they mentioned the throat wound Some people claimed initially that that wound in JFK's throat was an exit wound. However, one of the doctors that inspected JFK at the very beginning in Parkland Hospital, his name was Perry, Malcolm Perry. He looked at JFK's body and believed that that was an entry wound, and he said that. And another doctor at the facility, his name was Robert McClelland. He remembers from a press conference that happened during that time that someone told Perry, you can never say it again, that that was an entry wound. And that's what Joe was talking about there. So if you want to say that's a conspiracy theory, just fact check me on that. The evidence does exist that that was the case, that at least Perry thought that that was an entry wound. So that's where we're at. I think Epstein has the chance of being a new JFK, but we'll have to see. But I want to hear from you. Let me know down below, do you agree with Joe Rogan and Anna Paulina Luna? What have we learned from the JFK files? Who was involved in his death? What information is not being looked into regarding this more than others? Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Joe. Really appreciate this interview. Great segment from him. I think it was the best segment of his interview with Luna. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help out the channel, support me, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate it so much that in return, I will give you access to all my videos that are members only, that can be viewed before they go live to the general public. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.